walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors, walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path, life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Wowdy Yasid, and I will be your guide on the serpentine path of life. I'm a songkeeper, plant walker, storyteller, word weaver, artesana, visual and performance artist, daughter, granddaughter, sister, lover, student, and friend, among many, many, many other things. I've spent my life traversing through altered states of consciousness and find it fascinating to explore all the ways in which our modern culture has become almost entirely severed from our innate instinctual and intuitive ability to see beyond the veil of so called reality. In this podcast, I will be sharing my own personal stories and insights regarding all things related to plant medicine, the birth, death, rebirth cycle, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, dream work, rites of passage and initiations, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, and the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, all of which I consider to be portals into altered states of consciousness. I thank you with my deepest respect and humility for taking the time to open your ears, your minds, and your hearts to what it is that I have to share. The telling of one's story is an intimate and vulnerable experience. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, illuminating, liberating, and healing medicines that a person can offer to the world. Hearing the cadence in a storyteller's voice, their laughter, their tears, their tone, their pauses, their pain, their joy, their curiosity, and their heart's song is something that can only truly be experienced by way of oral storytelling. Thus, in honoring the storytelling lineages of all of our ancestors, I offer my story to you now. In another world, another time, another dream, we're all sitting together in front of a big fire, passing our visions across the flames and receiving the medicine in our hearts. So, again, welcome to the serpentine path where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. When I look back on my 27th year, it's a year that is marked by seasons of grief and mourning of 4 different deaths that I experienced. And they were the deaths of my elders. So when I say elders, I speak about both my 2 remaining blood grandparents, my mother's mother, Marnie, and my father's father, Gary, and my 2 spiritual grandparents, who I lived with and accompanied So the death of my spiritual grandmother, Abuela Maria, and my spiritual grandfather, Abuelo Querubin. So to give just a little bit of context, I turned 27 on June 25th, 2023, and I just turned 28 about a month ago. And I arrived back in the jungle on June 6th, I believe, June 6th or 7th of 2023. And I had been in the jungle with my teachers, with Abuelo Querubin and Abuela Maria, in March and April earlier that year. And then I had gone and done a little bit of traveling in Ecuador, and I came back in June. And it was kind of an unexpected return. I didn't think that I would be going to visit them until a little bit later in the year, but I got called back, and so I went and I arrived. And the very first ceremony that I sat in that night was with my teacher, Abuelo Querubin, and his wife, also my teacher, Abuela Maria, and with his son, Taita David, and some other members of his family, and with another group of people who were all there in ceremony. And this is the ceremony that profoundly changed my life. I'm going to go deeper into it in some future episodes, but essentially this was the ceremony where I started to come to terms with the fact that I had been sexually abused as a child. And a lot of things happened in that ceremony. Many unbelievable realizations came up for me. But one of the most beautiful moments of that ceremony was that my grandfather, Gary, came to me and started telling me his life story. My grandfather, Gary, is someone in my family who I never had a very close relationship with. Him and my grandmother were separated. And so as kids, we didn't spend a ton of time with him throughout my childhood, even though we lived in Colorado where he lived. And, you know, it was definitely something that I think I now really grieve and mourn, the fact that I didn't get to have a close relationship with my grandfather. My grandfather was an extremely complex person, as we all are, but he was a doctor and he was a healer. He was a person who had a really valuable and beautiful life, and he's part of the reason that I'm here on this earth. And so I just have the deepest love and respect and admiration for him, even though we were never particularly close. And it was also hard to get a lot of information about my grandfather from anyone in my family. He was a very private person in some ways and didn't share so much, and had a difficult time connecting with his own children. And it was complicated, you know, as all families are complicated. But this night in ceremony, he came to me and he started sharing his life story with me. And in that moment, I knew that it wasn't going to be too long until my grandfather died. And I understood that he was coming to me as his oldest grandchild to share the story of his life that he had never been able to share before, because he didn't necessarily have the communication skills and he didn't necessarily have the ability to be open and vulnerable. But he started coming to me in visions and in dreams and showing me what his childhood was like, and showing me what his youth was like, showing me all of the chapters of his life, being in the military, being in medical school, starting a family, losing a child, all of the pain and trauma that he went through, but also the beautiful parts of his life. He came to me and he shared. And this is the moment, this ceremony, that I feel began the year of midwifing my elders through the portal of death.
because it became just so extremely apparent that my grandfather was coming to me because he was close to dying. And my grandfather's health had really been faltering for years. But it was the moment when it was like, okay, like, this is getting real. And he's here to share so that his story isn't lost. So after that ceremony, I stayed in the jungle, and I had no idea how long I was going to stay for. I was in a very complicated place in my life, and I was planning on maybe just staying for a month or 2 months. I was going to see how things went. And more, it became very evident that I was not going to be leaving anytime soon. It was almost like anytime I tried to make plans to leave or had ideas about something else I was going to do, the universe just kind of came in and was like, nope, you stay right here. And part of the reason for that, I mean, there's many reasons for that, but part of the reason for that was because it was the last moments that I got to have with my teachers, Abuelo Querubin and Abuela Maria, before they passed away. So Abuelo Querubin had been sick at that point for almost a year. He had started getting sick in October of 2022 when I wasn't able to be in the jungle. The pueblo had been closed because of some political issues, and no foreigners were able to come through. And so for months, my partner and I were waiting to be able to get back to the jungle, but it was impossible for anyone who was not Indigenous to be coming through the territory. It was too dangerous. And during that time, my teacher, Abuelo Querubin, was really suffering. He was really sick. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is, my teacher, pretty much since he was born, was on the path to be not only a really powerful healer and shamanic practitioner, but also a political and community leader. And that was his role for his entire life, was being the healer and the community organizer and the pillar of strength in his community. And when the pueblo closed and nobody could come to him for healing, nobody could come to him to do ceremony, to drink medicine, to receive his words of wisdom, his stories, I mean, it was his community role, and it was taken from him. He of course had the people of the village who still depended on him, but he really got his strength from being the healer, from being the teacher, from being the guide. That was what he had been for his entire life, and he had traveled the world, literally like almost every single continent, doing ceremonies, sharing medicine. He had been invited to the House of Lords, to the United Nations, to the World Health Organization, to the White House, to peace conferences. That was his purpose in this life. And when the pueblo closed and there was no way to kind of come in or out, and he got sick, like, that's where his strength was derived from. And when people didn't need him to be the healer and to be the leader, he started really faltering in his health. And so I knew that his health was very delicate when I had been there in March and April. I had seen his process of healing and getting better and getting stronger as the weeks went by. But I knew that his health was very delicate, and so I stayed. And I accompanied him and his wife and the rest of his family. And I was pretty much alone, actually, down at the farm. In the village, there's all of the people's farms kind of down away from the street, and then they also sometimes have farms or houses up closer by the road. And so I was living down at Abuelo's farm, which was right by the river. And I was pretty much completely alone. My Spanish was not so strong at this point in time. I was in an entirely different culture, in an Indigenous village where I had spent time before, but never quite so alone. I had always been there either with my partner or with friends. And so this was profoundly challenging, to be completely alone, to be the only white girl, to be someone who is just a complete outsider in like every sense of the world, in the word, and to be so close to Abuelo and Abuela, to be spending like all day, every day with them by their side, to be helping them, helping take care of Abuelo, to accompanying them in ceremony, learning how to bead and weave with the Abuela. All of that was, I mean, one of the greatest gifts of my life. And also, like, so profoundly challenging in a way that words genuinely can't describe, you know? And so during this period that I was there alone, I watched Abuelo go through a lot of scares with his health. I watched him get really sick and not be able to leave the bed, and to be in like very severe pain, to have a lot of pain in his muscles and his bones, to be crying, to be saying that he wanted to die, you know, to be like incapable of getting out of bed. And then, you know, a week later, he would be back to his strength, and he would be doing ceremonies, and he would be healing people, and he would be laughing and talking and sharing his stories. And it was as if that sickness that he had experienced a week before, like, hadn't ever happened. And it was a really profound yo-yo, because also to be close to someone that has that degree of spiritual power, and to watch them get really, really bad and really, really good, it has a big effect on you. Not, I mean, it would have a big effect on you no matter what when you're helping to caretake someone and their lows are low and their highs are high. But when you're dealing with someone of that level of spiritual prowess, it is pretty immense, the effect that they can have on the people around them and just on the territory in general. Like, you could feel it in the village. Like, when the Abuelo was doing well, you could feel a lightness in the air. And when he was doing really bad, you could feel the heaviness. You could feel the fear of the people. You could feel the sadness. You could feel the grief. It was really fucking hard. Like, again, there's no words to describe. And as I said, I was helping take care of Abuelo with the Abuela Maria, who is the wife of Abuelo Querubin. And Abuela was tough. Abuela was so strong. And she was in really good health. And she was significantly younger than Abuelo Querubin. Abuelo Querubin was 110 years old, and Abuela Maria was, I think, 85 or 86 when she passed. So she was significantly younger. She was his second wife, and she was in really, really good health. This was a woman who was like running through the jungle with her machete, like, you know, cutting down fruit and going out and harvesting yucca and corn and plantains. She was feeding all of the animals. She had so many dogs. Like, she just loved animals. And she was really like the guardian of the space. Abuelo was so open-hearted, and he welcomed, like, literally any person from any walk of life, any race, any socioeconomic class, any profession, any age. It did not matter who they were. They were welcome in Abuelo's home and in Abuelo's heart. Abuela Maria was the one who created some structure to things. And so Abuela kind of kept people in line. When Abuelo was just like super excited to have people around, Abuela made sure that they were people who had Abuelo's best interests at heart. And she was very, very careful about who she allowed to get close to Abuelo, because she loved him so much, and she understood that a lot of people wanted to be close with Abuelo Querubin. He was an unbelievably powerful healer. He was the authority of the medicine of Yahe, the medicine of ayahuasca in Colombia. He's a political leader, and she wanted to just keep tight boundaries around her space, around her home. And so Abuela was just like a freaking warrior, my God. Every morning she was up with the sunrise. Every morning she was, you know, cooking over the fire, preparing some big food for the day. Every single day she was helping take care of Abuelo, but she was also cooking and feeding anyone who came into her house. She accompanied Abuelo in every single ceremony. She would come with her weaving. She would weave mochilas, little bags. Not always little, sometimes they were kind of bigger, but she would weave bags in ceremony, and all night long she would accompany. And she'd be weaving the entire time, literally in the dark with like a little light or sometimes a little candle. And so she was there no matter what. Abuela never took a day off, like at all. She was just so present, and she was also so scared and so sad and so deeply, deeply concerned for her husband and his well-being. And she wanted good people around to help, and so I stayed. And I'm so grateful that I had that time with them. And it was fascinating during this time because I was watching Abuelo Querubin die in front of me. And then in my dreams and in my visions in ceremony, I was watching my grandfather, Gary, dying. And it was such a stark contrast how I felt about my grandfather Gary's death versus how I felt about Abuelo Querubin's death. They were both really, really suffering, just profound suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of physical issues. But they were both really kind of pushing forward, and they were both making some pretty intense dips in their health and then rises and dips and rises. With my grandfather Gary at this time, we really thought that he was going to die multiple times. He had been in the hospital. They had considered him to be, what's the term? Like that he met the credentials to be able to do assisted suicide. And so he was going to do that. At one point, I believe that was maybe like in October or November of 2023. And then he would make these like really kind of big leaps with his health, and he would be okay enough to leave hospice or the hospital, but not actually okay enough that he was doing well, and he was just really suffering. And so I was watching Abuelo Querubin suffering in front of me, and I was seeing and feeling and hearing about my grandfather Gary really suffering. And with Gary, I was able to really just pray for him and say, like, Grandpa Gary, I'm so sorry that you're suffering. And I pray that you're able to find the strength and the peace and the surrender to let go and to move to the other side. You suffered for the majority of your life through so many difficult moments, so much pain, so much trauma. Please, as your oldest granddaughter, I'm telling you, like, it's okay. You can go. And that was my prayer almost every ceremony. I would pray at the fire for the life and death of my grandfather. And then with Abuelo Querubin, it was totally different. I knew that his death was inevitable. I knew that it could happen, like, almost at any moment because it was so delicate. But I had also seen him regain his strength so drastically, and to see him show up in ceremony as like the tiger that he is. And so I had a really hard time coming to terms with the fact that his death was just as inevitable as my grandfather's. And I really fought it. And I mean, it was just terrible, like having like full-on panic attacks about my teacher dying. And knowing that his death would just be monumental, would just be like earth-shattering, not just for me, but for his entire community because he was the leader of his nation, the Cofan people. He was the leader of his people. As I said, he was a world-renowned spiritual leader, politician, healer, médico tradicional, which means like traditional doctor of medicina botánica, which is, plant medicines, all the medicines of the jungle. And I knew that when he died, it was just going to be earth shattering for his family, his community, his nation, and also the fabric of kind of indigenous collaboration and coherence and community cooperation in the region of Putumayo, Colombia, and Ecuador, because he was driving not only his community, but also that of like, God, I don't know, 20 communities around, different indigenous groups, different nations. And so I was like just fighting. I was like, no, he cannot die, which is crazy now to think back on. I mean, the man lived to 110 years old, and his health only really started to falter when he was 109. And so, like, he lived a really, really profound and really full life. And yet I could not let him go. And I saw that with everyone around me, all of Abuelo's family members. None of them wanted to let him go. They were all so sad and so scared. So during this time, as I said, I'm watching my grandfather go through his process, and I'm watching Abuelo go through his process. And one night, I had a dream where I was terrified to give birth naturally, like at home with no doctors or any medical professionals, outside of a hospital, naturally, no medications, nothing, no electrodes attached to me or my belly or my baby, and to give birth the way that mothers have been giving birth for hundreds of thousands of millions of years. And in my dream, I had just this horrifying fear, like paralyzing fear. And my grandmother, Marnie, my mother's mother, she came to me in my dream. And she said to me, Claire, you don't have to worry. I'm going to be there with you when you give birth. And to clarify, I'm not pregnant. I was not pregnant at the time. I don't have plans to get pregnant anytime soon, but I am doing very, very deep work of unlearning a lot of birth trauma from my lineage, including my grandmother, who had a very traumatic first birth with my mother. And after that, she had fully natural vaginal births because she refused to repeat the experience that she had with my mother with her two younger children. And so my grandmother came to me and she just said, Claire, you don't have to worry. I'm going to be right there with you. You won't be alone in your process. And I knew in that dream that she was not going to be there with me physically. I knew that she meant that she was going to be there working with me spiritually from the other side. And I knew in that moment that my grandma was going to die soon. And I woke up in the morning and I remember thinking to myself, my grandma's time is close. It's coming. I don't know when, but she's going to pass pretty soon. And maybe a day or two later, my mom called me and told me that my grandmother had been taken to the hospital and that they had found a tumor in her bladder and that they were testing it, but that they thought that it was cancerous. And sure enough, probably less than a week later, she was diagnosed with, I believe, stage 4 bladder cancer. And so I knew. I just knew that her time was coming. And I remember that I wasn't sad. I was sad because my mother was heartbroken. But I remember feeling so at peace and saying to myself, yeah, her time is coming. And she's lived an unbelievable life. Like, unbelievable. She's 86 years old. She had an incredible partnership with my grandfather who passed a few years ago. She had a beautiful family, a really incredible career. She traveled all over the world. She was wildly intelligent and so curious and so kind. And she had such an unwavering faith in God. My grandmother was profoundly connected to her faith. And I knew that everything was going to be okay with her. As she was moving towards her transition, I knew that she was okay and that she wasn't going to fight. But I knew that it was her process, and so I just prayed for her as well. I prayed for her health, I prayed for her safety, I prayed for her peace. But I knew. So that was, I guess, in August, I believe. August, yeah. So one day in September, one of the other men who was helping look after Abuelo and who was accompanying the family called me at like 7 in the morning, and he asked me to come to Abuelo's house and help look after him. And I lived in a house just across a field from Abuelo, and Abuela was very close to them. And so I ran over. Abuela was out harvesting some food. I don't know exactly what she was harvesting, but she was out off in the fields far away, and the man had to go into town to grab something, and so he asked if I could accompany Abuelo, and I was like, of course. And so I went to Abuelo's house, and I cooked my food over there, and spent a little bit of time with him, but he was still in bed, he was still resting, and so I was just reading on the porch. And at a certain point, one of the teachers from the school came and he asked Abuela why he was alone there, and he was like, where's Abuela? And he said, oh, she went off into the fields to get some food or something. I don't know. Maybe you should call her. And so he called, and I heard Abuela over the phone, and she was yelling. And to be clear, Abuela was literally always yelling. It was kind of like her method of communication. She just had this this way of talking. So it didn't seem that crazy to me that she was kind of yelling over the phone, but there was something different in the cadence of her voice. And the man understood as well, and so he went out to the fields. And when he got there, she was lying on the ground and she couldn't move. And he asked her, Abuela Maria, what's going on? Are you okay? And she said, call my grandson in law. Tell him to bring his car. Tell him to come and get me and to take me to his house, which is where Abuela's granddaughter and Abuela's daughter and all of Abuela's grandchildren lived. She said, take me to his house. I want to die with my family. And so, a teacher from the school called Abuelo's granddaughter. She was the first one who answered. And I watched as Abuelo's granddaughter ran up to the house. Sorry, Abuela's granddaughter ran up to the house and her husband. And I saw the husband go running to the fields, and I didn't know what was happening. And the grandson in law came running back with Abuela over his shoulder. She was slumped like a rag doll, and she didn't have any strength in her arms, and she was flailing around. And they sat her down in a chair outside of the house, and I went and I got her water, and she was yelling, and she was puking, and she said, I'm gonna die. I'm going to die. I'm dying. And her granddaughter was crying and trying to keep her calm. And her other grandson-in-law arrived with his car and brought her daughter. Her daughter went into the house and got her mother's stuff. And at one moment, Abuelo was still in the house. He was asking what was going on, and so I went up to the house. And I told Abuelo, Mira, Abuelo, something's happening with Abuela. I don't know what's going on, but they're gonna try to take her up the house or maybe to the hospital, but something's going on. And they left with her. And pretty soon after, other members of Abuelo's family arrived down at the farm. And within about 15 minutes, a man from town came down and he very gently and very lovingly knelt down at Abuelo's feet, and he said, Abuelo, I came to tell you that your wife passed away in the car ride on the way up to the hospital. Our family is taking care of her, and we're all going to be down here to keep you company, but we need to clean the house and we need to take you up down. And Abuelo was very calm, and one of his granddaughters was there with me. And I just asked her, I was like, did I hear that correctly? Like, she died? And she said, yeah, dead. And I looked at Abuelo and I said, Abuelo, did Abuela die? And he goes, yeah. And I said, she's not alive. And he said, is she? And I said, I don't know, Abuelo, did she die? And other people told me, yeah. And very quickly, a lot of members from Abuelo Querubin's family arrived down at the farm. And the women started immediately cleaning the house, cleaning out the entire kitchen, cleaning out the bedroom, packing up all of Abuela Maria's stuff, moving Abuelo's bed, stripping all of the sheets, everything. And the men got to work building a fire so that they could have salmerio, which is a type of smoke that you use with like charcoal and different resins, particularly with like copal, sometimes with palo santo, different plants. And they were just circling the house, the men, like nonstop with different pots of the salmedio, of the smoke. And that's for spiritual protection and to keep like strong spirits away. And Abuelo was just silent. He didn't really say anything. And pretty immediately, a lot of elders from different communities started arriving and talking with Abuelo down at the farm. And I was entirely beside myself. I quite literally didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help. I didn't know what my place was. I was just kind of walking around like in complete shock. I was calling friends to tell them what had happened, and I remember calling and I told them Abuela just died. And everyone was like, who? Abuelo? Because everyone had expected that Abuelo Querubin was going to be dying at some point soon. And I said, no, Abuela Maria. And everyone was just like, oh my God, what? She was in perfect health. How is this possible? What happened? And just profound shock, right? And so that whole day, I was just on the phone with person after person after person, just crying and screaming, and them also crying and screaming on the phone, and just not having any concept of how to handle the shock of death. And I remember going into my room and I saw my mochila to carry my drum that Abuela had gifted me just 2 days before. And I realized that it was the last mochila that Abuela Maria had ever woven. She'd spent her entire life weaving and beading, and it was really like her life's work. And I had the last mochila that she had ever finished, and I just cried and cried and cried. Eventually, they came and they took Abuelo up to town, and they took all of his stuff that he would need to stay at one of the houses of one of his daughters. And I just stayed at the farm, completely in shock, and I was alone. And later that night, I went up to town where they were holding a vigil for Abuela, and I stayed until pretty late. And I went back to the farm that night, and I slept there. And everyone in the village was kind of scared for me. They were like, "Don't sleep down there alone. Do you have somewhere else to go?" And I was just like, "No, I just want to go home. I want to go to bed." And so that's what I did. And when I got down there, I felt fine. But the next day, one of the neighbors said to me, "Don't sleep there alone for now. Come to our house and you can spend the night. We have an extra room." So the next day was Abuela Maria's funeral. Again, like hundreds of people arrived at the village, and we buried her in the cemetery. And everyone was just profoundly shocked. I don't even know what to say, honestly, about that period of time. I mean, it felt like a fever dream. Like, it just felt like it couldn't be true. And when I went back down to the farm to grab my stuff to go to the neighbor's house, I grabbed my stuff and I was walking the road to walk up to the neighbor, and I heard someone singing. And it was Abuela's voice, and it was all around where she had planted food, and by the river where she had washed clothes, in the kitchen where she had cooked. And for like 10 minutes, I just heard her singing, and I just cried. And then I went to the neighbor's house, and I spent the night there for a few weeks. I think maybe a week or two. I would go every night. I would sleep there, and every night I would go and I would wake up right at the sunrise, like at like 5 in the morning, the second that the sun even started peeking out. I would wake up and I would like run back to the farm. And I don't know why. Something was just calling me to go back there. I couldn't stay away. I didn't want to be anywhere else. And I was drawing and I was beading and I was weaving, like how Abuela had taught me. And I was so at peace. Just so at peace down there. And I was completely alone. There was no one. Literally no one at the farm. Everyone was up in town taking care of Abuelo. And I stayed down. And after a few days, Abuelo Querubin called me, and he asked why I hadn't come up to town to visit. And I told him, I wanted to give you a few days to be with just family. And then when I was going to come up, my moon started. I got my period. And in the Cofan tradition, when you're on your moon, you don't go visit the shamans. There's a lot of reasons for that I can talk about in a future episode, but culturally it's respectful to just follow that guideline. And so I told him, estoy con la luna, I'm on my moon and I can't come visit for a few days. And he said, okay, I was really worried about you. I didn't want you to feel abandoned down at the farm, and you can always come up and visit and spend time. Bring your weaving, bring your beading. You can sit by me up here like how you always did when I was at the farm. And I just said, Abuelo, please don't worry about me. You just lost your wife. Please let us worry about you. I'm okay. I'm okay. He said, okay, bueno. Well, I'm going to be down later this week. We're going to do ceremony with some of my nephews. They're going to come from their village and we're going to drink. And so when I come, we can talk, okay? I said, okay, Abuelo. He said, okay, take care of yourself. And a few days later, he came for ceremony and we talked for, I don't know, maybe like 2 hours before ceremony, just us alone. And we talked and, you know, I asked him how he was doing with Abuela's death. And he told me, you know, I really had no idea. And I asked him, are there other times when you know? And he said, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I see it in visions or in dreams, or you just have a feeling, or somebody has, you know, an air around them that you just know that their death is coming and you can prepare for it. But with her, I had no idea. I thought that I was going to be the one who died before her. And he looked at me and he said, Clarita, I really have no idea why I'm still alive. I don't know what my destiny is. I don't know why I'm still here. But I'm going to keep healing people. I'm going to keep leading my people. I'm going to keep doing my work. What else can I do? This is my purpose in this life, so I'll keep doing it until the day that I die. And I was so shocked and so moved by what he said, because I was looking at this man who is one of the most powerful shamans in the entire jungle. And even he was, he could do nothing to fight against death and the grief that comes with it and the confusion. And it was so beautiful. I loved him and respected him even more in that moment because he was able to just be honest and vulnerable with me and say, I have no idea what the fuck is going on. But I'm just gonna keep going, because what else can you do in this life, you know? And so after that, Abuelo would kind of go back and forth between living down at the farm and living up in town, depending on who could take care of him. It was easier for the family when he was up in town, but he really preferred to be down at the farm. It was a lot easier for him. And it was so interesting because a lot of people were so scared that I was down at the farm alone. People from the village were really scared. And one of Abuelo's sons said to him, he was like, ay, papa, like, Clarita is down there all alone, and I'm worried for her. And Abuelo said, I'm not worried for her. Los invisibles are taking care of her, and los invisibles are like the invisible people, the spirits, the ancestors. He said, los invisibles are taking care of her. She's fine. I'm not worried about her at all. And he was right. I felt completely safe and protected and cared for, and I felt so close to Abuela that whole time. And she came to me in dreams and shared some really beautiful gifts with me and beautiful advice. But it was, I mean, just heartbreaking because Abuela had also been Abuela's full-time caretaker, and so it jolted the whole family into this process of having to figure out how they were going to take care of Abuelo.
So over the next few months, Abuela went back and forth between living up in town and down at the farm, depending on how his health was going, depending on which member of the family was taking care of him at the time. And in November, my partner, Vincent, came back to the jungle, finally, after months of being away and working. He was able to finally come back. And when he came back, we were responsible for looking after the farm and taking care of the farm when Abuelo wasn't down there. And we would go up and visit him in town every day and spend time with him and accompany him. And when he was down at the farm, Vincent was kind of like his part-time caretaker. There was another man, a member of the family, who was his full-time caretaker, who would look after him day and night, and Vincent would be there during the day to help out. And also in ceremony, we were there all the time. Vincent was right by his side along with the other caretaker. And as I said, you know, Abuelo kept going through these like
big yo-yos of his health being really strong and then his health really deteriorating and then going back up and back down and back up and back down, which was a really intense time. So towards the end of the year, around December, I knew I was going to be going back to the States to visit my family for Christmas. And my grandmother, the one who had been diagnosed with bladder cancer, I think it was like, I don't know, the third week of December, about a week before I left to go visit my family, my mom called me to let me know that my grandmother was in the hospital and that even though she had had some operations earlier in the year to try to clear out the cancer as best they could, things were really not looking good. And within a day or two, my grandmother decided that she was ready to move into palliative care and to make her transition. And so in this time, I think it was about maybe 3 days that she was in palliative care. And I had a beautiful dream of my grandma that night that she first moved over. I had this dream of my grandma coming to me along with all of the mothers in my family on that side of the family. So it was my grandma, my grandma's cousin, who I would consider like a great aunt, my mom, my mom's sister, so my aunt, and a few other women of the family who weren't necessarily like blood relatives, but they were like mothers to me in different ways. And they all came to me in this dream. And they all shared with me what it meant to become a mother themselves and what it meant to become a grandmother. How that wheel just continues turning. It was the most beautiful and peaceful dream. I knew that my grandma was really at peace. I knew that she wasn't fighting or suffering or struggling. She was really at peace. And the next morning, I was able to call her, and she was fully unconscious at this point. Like, she wasn't able to really talk or open her eyes, but she was still alive. And so my mom asked if I wanted to call and to say my goodbyes, which I did want to do. And I called my grandma and I just thanked her so much for her life, thanked her so much for all of the gifts that she passed down to me. I thanked her for her example that she set for her children and for her grandchildren, always prioritizing education and learning. She was so curious and so interested. She was profoundly respectful and kind of other people's visions, even if she really didn't agree with it. She was really funny in her own way. She was also kind of reserved, but she was so beautiful. I thanked her for the example that she offered in her relationship with my grandfather, which was incredibly healthy and kind and respectful and loving. And they really supported one another. They were each other's biggest cheerleaders. They never spoke badly about one another. They were a really, really strong couple together. And I told her about my life and what I was doing in the jungle, everything I was learning. I told her about my partnership and how her marriage had really inspired me to find a partner who was loving and supportive and who had a very similar spiritual path to me in the way that my grandparents did. Their faith really brought them together and made them really strong together. And then I sang to her. I sang and I prayed, and I asked all of the ancestors to guide her to the other side, lovingly and peacefully and beautifully. And afterwards, I talked with my mom and my aunt a little bit, and they were both crying, and they thanked me for my prayers and everything I said. And my mom told me that afterwards, when I hung up the phone, she asked her mom if she had heard me. And as I said, my grandma was like kind of unconscious at this point, but she squeezed my mom's hand. So the next day, I was on my way to the States, and to get back to the States from the jungle is quite a trek. I had to go in a camioneta, which is like the back of a truck, 2 hours out of the jungle in the back of the truck. And then I get to a town where then I would take another truck to a city about an hour and a half away, take that flight to Bogota, spend the night in Bogota, and then take an early morning flight to New York City. So it's always a big trip. And when I took the first leg of the trip, which was to the nearest town to get the bus to the airport, I arrived and I just did a little bit of shopping for stuff that I would need for the trip. And as I sat down with my partner to kind of have a goodbye juice together at a little cafe, I checked my phone, and my dad texted me and said, "Your grandma just passed away. She died just about a minute before I walked into the room. I walked out to do something, and I came back and she had just passed." And I just felt so at peace. It was really beautiful with my grandma's death. I was so proud of her, so grateful to her, so happy that she was no longer suffering, because her last few years her health was really deteriorating badly. And because I knew that she missed my grandfather so much, really missed him, and she was really, really suffering without him. And so I was so happy that they were together again. And so I was totally at peace. And I remember I got to the airport in Puerto Asís, and I had some time before my flight, and I sat down at a little restaurant across from the airport, and I talked with this little abuela who ran the restaurant, and she was asking me where I was going, and I said, "Back to the States." She said, "Oh, to do what?" I said, "To visit family. You know, my grandmother just passed away today." And she said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm also a grandmother, and I know how beautiful that link is between grandchildren and their grandparents." And she told me all about her life, and we talked for probably like an hour while I was eating, and afterwards on my flight, she just prayed for me and for my trip back to the States, and prayed for my family in our time of grief and mourning. It was so sweet. And I got back to the States, I guess, when was it, the next day, long trip. And we drove immediately to my grandparents' house in Connecticut, and it was very hard, of course. Like, my mom was devastated, my uncle wasn't there. He had to go back to Massachusetts to get his boys. But we had Christmas at my grandma's house, which was beautiful and also so sad. And about a week later, before I went back to Colombia, and before other people traveled to different parts of the country back home, we did a graveside memorial for my grandma, just to bury her in the earth. And it was such an interesting contrast to see the difference between the funerals, back in the States with my blood family, and then the funeral that had just occurred a few months earlier in the jungle with Abuela Maria's family and Abuelo Querubin's family. I remember at Abuela Maria's funeral, I mean, just everyone was crying. A lot of people were screaming. Everyone was really vocal and expressive in their grief. And to be clear, like a lot of the time, Indigenous people kind of keep their emotions under wraps. They're not often like so expressive, especially around like sadness or pain. They laugh a lot and they share a lot and they joke a lot and they do share like serious things with people, but it's rare that you see them like really crying and breaking down. And during Abuela Maria's funeral, I mean, people were just like losing it, you know? People were like passing out. People were like seriously, seriously grieving. And then at my grandma's memorial, everyone was trying to really like keep it together and trying not to cry and saying sorry for crying and feeling embarrassed for their emotions, and it made me so sad. It made me so sad because I was like, no, we anybody who wants to scream right now should be able to scream, you know. Anybody who wants to cry and howl and fall on the ground and do whatever they want to do in their souls, like, should be able to do it. And it was just such a stark contrast for me to see how we handle death in the West and how we handle grief and mourning and that whole process. But the memorial was beautiful, and it was also very true to my grandma's faith. My grandma was Episcopalian. You know, Episcopalians really keep it kind of tight. um, and I read a Bible verse, the only Bible verse that I know, which makes it my favorite one, which is a passage from Ecclesiastes. And I had found out that it was actually my grandma's favorite Bible verse a few years back when I sent it to her on spring equinox. She told me that that was her favorite Bible verse. So I was able to read it to her, and I don't have the whole passage memorized, but I do know one part of it, which is my favorite part. And it's Ecclesiastes 3:4, if anyone's familiar. And it's a time to weep, time to laugh, time to mourn, and a time to dance. And I'll probably share the whole passage on Patreon with the addition to this episode. But that was beautiful, my grandmother's memorial, and or I guess her graveside memorial. And I knew that my mom and her siblings were planning a bigger memorial in the summer. So there would be another opportunity to celebrate her life alongside the life of my grandfather, who we didn't get to celebrate because he died during COVID. So I knew that that was going to be coming up in about 6 months during the end of June.
Okay, I'm gonna pause there for this first half of this two-part episode, and I'll share with you a little bit about what I'm gonna offer with the extended Patreon episode. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the similarities between Abuela Maria and my grandmother Marnie in terms of how they approached death. Even though Abuela Maria's death was very sudden, there's kind of a longer story to it. So I share more about that on the Patreon, and also just about a little bit more about my grandmother and her character and her fortitude, and yeah, those few days leading up to her dying process and how she approached it and how she arrived at death's door. It's a really beautiful story and just kind of showcases my grandmother's deep, deep faith in God, which I've touched on a lot, but it can't be understated that like my grandma was a woman of faith, you know, like truly to her core. Um, and then I also am gonna share one story that was very funny and also like a lot of pressure, which was when I became the official protector of Abuela Maria's chickens when she died, which is really a crazy story. It was so funny and also, as I said, like so stressful. Like there was a lot riding on that. And then I close also by sharing the Bible verse that I read at my grandmother's memorial, which also happens to be my favorite Bible verse and also the only Bible verse that I know, and also, as I mentioned, my grandmother's favorite Bible verse. So I think that it's a beautiful Bible passage to share um, for any phase of life, but particularly for people who are going through their own process of grief and mourning. It's brought me a lot of comfort, and I've come back to it many, many times. So I'm going to share that with you guys. And you can find all of that on the Patreon for subscribers. So the link will be in the show notes if you would like to join. All right, thank you guys so much. And the second part of the episode will be out soon, so be on the lookout. All right.